Welcome to the Illinois State Board of Elections Division of Campaign Disclosure tutorial on quarterly reports, Form D2. In this lesson, we will cover the basic filing requirements associated with reporting a committee's financial activity on a quarterly report. This information includes the receipt and expenditure types, date of receipt, itemization thresholds and prohibitions, along with quarterly filing dates, methods for filing, and finally, how to complete a D2. Let's begin with receipts. Receipts can be categorized into 5 different types: individual contributions, transfers in, loans received, other receipts, and in-kind contributions. Individual contributions are receipts received from an individual person, business, organization, or association. For contributions received from businesses, organizations, and associations, the contribution must originate from a general revenue fund to be an individual contribution. The next receipt type are transfers in. Transfers in are contributions from another political committee. Anytime you hear the word transfer, you should immediately think of committee-to-committee activity. So in the case of transfers in, another committee has given your committee a contribution. The third type of receipt is loans received. Loans received include both institutional and personal loans. The terms and conditions of any loan need to be in writing. Loans received will be reflected on both a Schedule A as a loan received and a Schedule C for debts and obligations. The fourth type of receipt is classified as other receipts. Other receipts should be used to bring funds into the committee that are not direct contributions. Common examples of other receipts are interest or dividends, voided checks, security deposits, or other situations where funds are returned to the committee. The final type of receipt is an in-kind contribution. In-kind contributions include anything of value other than cash donated to a political committee. In-kinds can be either goods or services received and should be reported at fair market value. In addition to the receipt types, it is equally important to understand the date the contribution was received. Depending on the situation, the date of receipt from a disclosure standpoint may change. Generally speaking, the date of receipt boils down to the date the funds were available for use by the committee. As such, cash contributions are deemed as received once the committee either deposits the cash or, if not deposited, the date the committee received the cash. Contributions received via checks, on the other hand, are considered to be received on the date the committee deposits or cashes the check and are not necessarily the date the committee is given the check. A little more complicated than either cash or checks are in-kind contributions. The deemed receipt date for in-kind contributions is the date the committee obtains knowledge of the in-kind contribution, but only if the committee didn't actually obtain possession of the goods or services. If the committee does receive the actual goods or services, the contribution is considered made on the date the recipient receives the goods or the date the services are actually performed. Contributors of in-kinds are required to notify the recipients of the contributions. In most cases, a committee receiving an in-kind should report it as received on the date the committee receives notification of it from the contributor, rather than the date listed on that notification. Now that we know both the type and date of receipts, let's take a look at the itemization thresholds. When filing a quarterly report, the committee will be disclosing all of the funds received within the given quarter, but the amount of information required for each receipt will differ depending on the amount of the contribution. All receipts that are $150 or less in aggregate from any source may be reported as non-itemized. When reporting non-itemized receipts, you can add all the receipts of $150 or less in aggregate together and report them all in one lump sum. Receipts of more than $150, though, need to be itemized. Itemized receipts will require the name, address, date, and amount of the contribution to be reported on a Schedule A, except that itemized in-kind contributions are reported on a Schedule I. Anytime an individual gives a committee more than $500, their employer and occupation will also need to be provided. When looking at whether or not a receipt needs to be itemized, it's important to remember that a committee must have records for all contributions received. Keeping good records will ensure that you have all the information required for the quarterly report. Keep in mind there are some prohibitions on receipts. Committees are not allowed to accept anonymous contributions, contributions made in the name of another person, or allowed to solicit or accept contributions on state property unless rented or leased. Finally, legislative committees or committees for executive branch officers cannot hold fundraisers on days the legislature is in session. With better understanding of receipts, let's now look at what you will need to know about expenditures for the quarterly report. Like receipts, there are different types of expenditures. The first type is a transfer out. Just like on the receipt side, whenever the word transfer is heard, you should immediately think of committee-to-committee activity. As a result, the classification of transfer out should be used to disclose funds that your committee has contributed to another political committee. The next type of expenditures, loans made. Loans made are rare. The loans made must be in furtherance of the committee's activity and should have a written agreement between the committee and the entity receiving the loan. Loans made will be reflected on a quarterly report both in the expenditure section under loans made as well as on an investment schedule until the loan is repaid or forgiven. There are regular expenditures. This is for expenses such as rent, office equipment, printing, and signs. If the committee is spending funds to further its operations, then more than likely it will be classified as an expenditure. The last type of expenditure, independent expenditures. Independent expenditures are those made for the purpose of creating electioneering communications or express advocacy in support or opposition to a candidate or question of public policy that are not made in any coordination or consultation with another entity. Independent expenditures do not include activity for your own committee and should not be confused with regular expenditures. Just like receipts, expenditures have the same $150 itemization threshold. Expenditures should have a clear purpose, and when you report reimbursements, you should report the ultimate vendor rather than the individual who is being reimbursed. All expenditures of $150 or less in aggregate to any source can be reported as non-itemized by lumping the small expenditures together and reporting as one amount. Expenditures in excess of $150 need to be itemized. Itemized expenditures will require the name and address of the vendor along with the date, amount, and purpose of the expenditure. Also, similar to receipts, there are prohibitions on expenditures. A list of prohibitions on expenditures may be found in the Campaign Disclosure Act at 10 ILCS 5/9-8.10. Next up, when to file a quarterly report. As the name indicates, a quarterly report, Form D2, discloses all the activity that took place within a given quarter of the year. The 4 quarters are January 1st to March 31st, April 1st to June 30th, July 1st to September 30th, and finally October 1st to December 31st. The filing period for a quarterly report will begin the day after the close of a quarter and will continue until the 15th following the close of a quarter, unless that falls on a weekend or a holiday, in which case it will end on the next business day. There are 2 different methods to file a quarterly report. The first way is to file electronically. Any committee which at any time during any reporting period has a balance of $10,000 or more, or reaches $10,000 or more in receipts or expenditures, must file campaign disclosure reports electronically. Once a committee has crossed the threshold requiring it to file electronically, it must continue to do so until the committee dissolves, even if it drops below the threshold. To file electronically, all committees, regardless of what system is used, the IDIS system or an outside vendor, will need to call the Board of Elections to set up an electronic filing account. Setting up an account only takes a few minutes. The State Board can only provide support for the IDIS system, Once an account has been set up with the Board of Elections, you can access the IDAS3 login page at idis3.elections.il.gov or click on the IDAS3 link on our homepage. Once logged into the IDAS system, you will need to enter all the receipts and expenditures for the quarter. For detailed instructions on how to enter transactions into IDAS, follow the IDAS3 help menu or reference the IDAS3 manual, both of which have step-by-step instructions including pictures of the icons. Once all transactions have been entered, follow the steps to file a report, sending it to the Board of Elections. Faxing or emailing a paper report does not count as an electronic filing. The second method of filing a quarterly report is to file on paper using a form called a D2 and the appropriate schedules. Printable forms are available at elections.il.gov under the Campaign Disclosure tab. Let's now look at how to prepare a quarterly report on paper. Starting with the quarterly report cover page, Form D2, you will first want to indicate whether the report is a quarterly, final, or amendment, and what quarter the report is covering. For a quarterly filing, check one of the 4 corresponding quarters to indicate which quarter the D2 is covering. For a final report, check the box marked final, as it will indicate to the board that the information contained in this D2 is the last financial disclosure of the committee and that the committee's balance has been zeroed out. If a committee is making an amendment to a previously filed quarterly report, you'll need to check not only amendment, but also one of the 4 corresponding quarter boxes to indicate which quarter is being amended. Place the committee's name and address at the top of the report. If the committee's address has changed, place a check mark in the provided box. If the committee would like to receive email notifications or change the email address on file for notifications, mark the provided box and place the email address you want to use in the provided space. Then enter the quarterly period date and the amount the committee had at the beginning of that period. The beginning amount should be the same amount reported at the close of the previous reporting period. Or if the D2 is your first quarterly report, the amount of funds available indicated on your D1. In this example, the quarterly report covers January 1st through March 31st, and the committee has started the quarter with $1,000. Next, Section A will be where you input all of your receipt totals. Let's look at an example. In this example, amounts have been entered to reflect the total amounts for each category of receipts. All the receipts in this example total up to $4,500, which is reflected in the receipts total line in Section A. Furthermore, in this example, we have stated that the committee received $500 in itemized in-kind contributions. In-kind contributions do not change the total receipts amount because in-kinds will have a monetary value but are not direct contributions of funds. All amounts that are reported on an itemized line 1A, 2A, 3A, and 4A should have a Schedule A to accompany them, and the amount reflected on line 5A should have a Schedule I to itemize its activity. Similar to Section A, Section B is where you will input all of your expenditure totals. For example, the committee's total expenses have been broken down into totals for each expenditure category. Like in the receipts section, the total amount of all expenditure types will be reported in the total expenditure line in Section B. Additionally, all amounts reported on the itemized expenditure lines 6A, 7A, and 8A should have an accompanying Schedule B, and the amount reflected on line 9A for independent expenditures will need a Schedule B9. Section C of the D2 is for total outstanding committee debts and obligations. The lines in Section C should equal the amount reported on lines 3A and 3B in the receipts section, along with any other outstanding debts or obligations of the committee. Lastly, on the D2 cover page, Section D is for cash balance totals. Line A in the total section should reflect the same amount listed at the top of the form for beginning balance. Line B will reflect the total receipts line in Section A, and line C in the total section will reflect the totals of the 2 lines above. Line D of the total section reflects the same amount reported on the total expenditures line in the expenditure section. Line E will be an amount equal to lines C minus D and should equal the amount the committee has as of the close of the quarter. Additionally, the amount reflected on line E should be reconcilable with the committee's bank balance. Line F in the total section is for investments. Itemized investments should have an accompanying investment schedule. If the committee did not purchase or hold any investments, then the line on the D2 should be left blank. Once the totals on the D2 cover page and schedules have been filled out, the treasurer or candidate of the committee must sign and date the quarterly report. Additionally, if another person other than the committee's officers or candidate submits the report, then place the name and address of the individual submitting the report on the lines on the lower left. As previously mentioned, all amounts reported on itemized lines need to have an accompanying schedule to report the itemized transactions. All itemized receipts will be reported on a Schedule A and Schedule I. To fill out a Schedule A, place your committee's name, committee ID, and reporting period at the top of the form. Next, check the receipt type you are reporting on this schedule. Depending on committee activity, multiple Schedule A's may be required. Finally, on the lines below, you will report the names, addresses, dates, amounts, and possibly employer and occupation information for contributions requiring itemization. The total on each Schedule A should reflect the same amounts listed on the itemized receipts lines on the D2 cover page. Schedule I should be used to report all itemized in-kind contributions received. To fill out a Schedule I, place your committee's name, committee ID, and reporting period at the top of the form. Next, in the space provided, list the name and address of the contributor who gave the itemized in-kind, the deemed receipt date, and the amount. In addition to the deemed received date, the committee must also report the date the in-kind contribution was originally made. You can put that information in the description box. Along with the aforementioned information, the committee will need to report the name and address of the vendor and a brief description of the in-kind. Again, the description should contain not only a brief description of the in-kind, but also the date it was originally given. The total on the bottom of the Schedule I should reflect the same amount as reported on line 5A for itemized in-kind contributions. Itemized expenditures are handled in the same way, only they are reported on Schedules B and B9. To fill out a Schedule B, place your committee's name, committee ID, and reporting period at the top of the form. Next, check the expenditure type you are reporting on this schedule. Depending on committee activity, multiple Schedule Bs may be required. On the lines below, report the name and address of the vendor along with the date and amount. The total of each Schedule B should reflect the same amounts listed on the itemized expenditure lines of the D2. Along with the Schedule B, if a committee makes independent expenditures in excess of $150, a Schedule B9 is required. A B9 is only needed for independent expenditures and should not be used to disclose regular operating expenses. To fill out a B9, place your committee name, committee ID, and reporting period at the top of the form. In the space provided, place the name and address of the vendor to which the expenditure was made for the independent expenditure. Then place the date, amount, and purpose of the independent expenditure. Next, check the box to indicate whether the independent expenditure is supporting or opposing a candidate, the candidate's name, and the office and district of the candidate. Finally, a B9 must be signed and dated by either the committee treasurer or candidate. Schedule C should be used to disclose all outstanding committee debts and obligations as well as loan repayments. To fill out a Schedule C, place your committee name, committee ID, and reporting period at the top of the form. Next, list all outstanding itemized debts and obligations, including the name of the entity that gave the loan, date, amount, any repayments on the debt, and the outstanding balance of the debt as of the close of the reporting period. Schedules A, I, B, and C are the most commonly used forms for reporting committee activity, but other forms may be required depending on the nature of a committee's activity. To file a paper D2, fill out the D2 cover page along with any and all schedules required based on your committee's activity. A D2 may be filed in either the Springfield or Chicago offices by mailing, hand-delivering, faxing, or emailing, as long as your committee is not required to file electronically. If your committee chooses to send your D2 in the mail, please note that the D2 must be postmarked at least 3 days in advance of the last day to file to be considered timely filed if it is received after the deadline. To review, in this lesson we have covered all the information required to file a D2. This includes various information on receipts and expenditures, methods of filing a D2, and finally how to complete a paper D2. For more information, please see our other campaign disclosure tutorials and publications, or contact campaign disclosure staff in either our Springfield or Chicago offices. Thank you.